safe and Merry Christmas. Top of the hour every hour, good evening. An initial IDF probe into the killings of 3 Israeli hostages by Israeli forces suggests all were shirtless, with one holding a makeshift white flag. More than 130 hostages are believed to still be in Gaza, with an additional 100 released since October 7. On seeing these 3 men, one Israeli soldier reportedly shouted "terrorists" to the other forces, initiating fire. 2 hostages were hit immediately and fell to the ground, but a third managed to escape in a nearby building while screaming for help in Hebrew. However, he was also shot and killed. The IDF says it had mistakenly identified 3 Israeli hostages as a threat and as a result fired towards them. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described it as a difficult and unbearable tragedy. Israeli bulldozers have crushed Palestinians taking shelter in tents outside Gaza's Kamal Adwan hospital, according to reports from multiple media outlets, several witnesses and medics. Multiple graphic videos posted to social media by local journalists, which have been verified by 6 News as being taken at the hospital within the past 24 hours, appear to show bodies under destroyed tent material. Al Jazeera Arabic's Anas al-Sharif said, per Al Jazeera, quote, "Dozens of displaced, sick and wounded people were buried alive. Bulldozers trampled the tents of the displaced people in the hospital yard and brutally crushed them." Gaza's health minister has called for an investigation into information that people had been buried alive in the hospital yard. UN humanitarian agency OCHA earlier reported that Kamal Adwan Hospital was surrounded by Israeli troops and tanks, with 65 patients, including 12 children in ICU and 6 newborns in incubators inside. Several Queensland ministers are out of the cabinet as Stephen Miles settles in as the new Premier. He's set to face an election in less than a year and has told 6 News he is confident that the best choice for Queenslanders continues to be Labor. National Affairs editor Austin Pollock has more from outside State Parliament in Brisbane.
Ready to get to work after being sworn in.
But now it's really about delivering for Queenslanders. It's not about us. It's never been about us. It's about what's best for Queensland.
The new Premier not quite familiar with his new role.
Stephen Miles, Queensland Premier. It is the first time I've said that. And I and our entire... Today, the Deputy Premier and I...
Knuckling down just 10 months out from the state election, announcing a new slogan for their government.
This is about fresh faces and a fresh focus.
And fresh policies, a bold emissions reduction target, decreasing emissions by 75% before 2035, and a complete review of all development projects for the 2032 Olympic Games, with the controversial Gaza redevelopment now up in the air.
We need to do that in conjunction with all of the partners. We'll need to talk to all of them before we settle those details.
Plus providing cost of living relief, fixing community safety issues, health and housing supply.
We want to spend the next 10 months delivering on the things that Queenslanders care about.
A new look ministry is set to be unveiled tomorrow, hoping the fresh faces give a fresh start to the government. But the opposition is hoping voters won't buy in.
The same people who've sat around the table that have delivered the youth crime crisis, the housing crisis and the health crisis. Queenslanders are looking and they're seeing more of the same.
6 News was the first and only media outlet to speak to Stephen Miles one-on-one just minutes after being elected by his party as the 40th Premier of Queensland.
So how was it in there with the caucus meeting?
Look, it was a really good meeting and I'm really honoured to have the support of my colleagues. Yep. But now it's really about delivering for Queenslanders. I'll be off to the Governor's house, she'll swear me in, and then we'll get straight to work. I'm confident that the best thing for Queensland is a Labor government. I know that an LNP government would be very, very dangerous for Queensland.
The Cabinet is set for a shake-up with 5 new ministers in Nikki Boyd, Barton Mellish, Lance McCallum, Michael Healy and Therese Mullen, their portfolios yet to be confirmed. However, Therese is expected to be the Transport Minister, with Glenn Butcher, Police Minister, and Michael Healy as Tourism Minister. Ministers losing portfolios: Mark Bailey, the retiring Sterling Hinchcliffe, Craig Crawford, and Anastasia Palaszczuk.
What do you have to say to her about her leadership?
She's a dear friend, she's done a great service to Queensland and she will always be remembered as a trailblazer for women and an inspiration for young girls.
Stephen Miles, unlike Palaszczuk, has confirmed he will not be the Minister for the Olympics, adding one more MP into the mix. The role of Police Minister Mark Ryan is also up in the air, with rumours he may become Attorney General, ousting Yvette Duff.
It's an exceptional honour to be minister in any government, but when you get to work alongside the heroes of your community, not sure yet about what the ministerial portfolio allocation will be, but I love the agencies that I've got responsibility for at the moment, and I hope they appreciate that they mean a big part of me and my service to Queensland.
The New Look ministry will be sworn in on Monday. Austin Pollock, 6 News.
Heavy rain continues in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Jasper in far north Queensland. The Bureau of Meteorology says more than 500 millimetres of rain has fallen since 9 a.m. Saturday. Several thunderstorms were warned for in central and southeast parts of the state, while intense rainfall warnings in place for the far north. Hundreds of households remain without power, with 40,000 initially left in the dark following Jasper. The Treasurer has forecast the possibility of more cost of living relief in the next federal budget. Jim Chalmers says the government will factor in several elements to see whether further assistance is provided, as new polling shows frustration growing amongst the public. Political editor Roman McKinnon has more.
Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers has announced a potential to ease the pain of cost of living in next year's budget. The Guardian is reporting that the Treasurer is working on measures to help families with cost of living if it doesn't fuel inflationary pressures. The mid-year budget update was handed down during the week, with Chalmers also looking at a new policy for accelerating the transition to net zero emissions. Chalmers said, quote, "People are still under pressure. It won't just get to January 1 and all of a sudden all that pressure people feel will just disappear, unfortunately. If I could click my fingers and make it disappear, I would." He also went on to say that the government will, quote, "factor in the pressures that people are facing, the budget position and the economic circumstances to see whether we will provide some further assistance and some further relief."
Responsible economic management, it's what puts downward pressure on inflation and eases the cost of living. And because of our efforts, we are getting the budget in much better nick and making more room for our priorities, and that's what these numbers that we are releasing today show. Our strategy over the past 18 months has delivered an historic turnaround in the budget position, but we know that there is still much more work to do. Our government's economic plan is at its core about 3 things: easing cost of living pressures, repairing the budget, and investing in the foundations of growth in our economy.
Recent opinion polling is showing support for Albanese and the Labor government is decreasing, with voters becoming frustrated about not taking enough action to ease cost of living. The latest news poll conducted at the end of last month shows Albanese's approval rating sitting at 40, while his disapproval is at 53 points. Labor took a 4-point hit in primary voting, sitting at just 31, while the opposition is at 38. Anthony Albanese remains the preferred Prime Minister, outpolling Peter Dutton 46 to 35. On Thursday, it was announced that unemployment rose to 3.9%, and in November, while the cash rate remains at 4.35%, while the RBA isn't expected to meet until February.
Founding AC/DC drummer Colin Burgess has died. Burgess was an original member of the Aussie rock band when it began in 1973, but was fired the following year after being accused of being drunk on stage. He was later inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame for his work with rock group The Masters Apprentices. No cause of death was given. He was 77. That is 6 News for now. You can of course stay up to date by heading to our website and following us on social media at SIXNewsAU. News is on the hour every hour here on 6 News. For now though, I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Thanks for your company. Good night.
When news breaks around the world, 6 News has got you covered. We've stopped at nothing to provide you with the latest details on every single breaking news event with reporters right across the globe.
On Friday, the rain bomb detonated.
We're going to take you to breaking news right now.
Good evening. We begin this hour with breaking news.
Online across multiple platforms, 24/7 and news on the hour. We get the facts directly to you.
Thousands have gathered across the country.
At polling booths today, we've pretty much seen the same story.
Breaking live any time of the day.
Coming on the air at 11:51 p.m. with some extraordinary breaking news.
That's why you'll get the facts first on 6 News.
From the moment you get up, 6 News has you covered. We'll keep you informed with what's happened overnight, both here at home and overseas, and let you know what to expect right throughout the day.
Extraordinary scenes overnight.
Going to be a big day.
The news starts here every morning on 6 News.
Merry Christmas from all of us here at 6 News.
Merry Christmas, Australia.
Merry Christmas from all of us at 6 News.
Merry Christmas from all of us here at 6 News.
From all of us here at 6 News, have a very safe and Merry Christmas.
In the news this week, more migration slashes the cost of living. A new argument raised to contradict the popular narrative. An exclusive interview coming up.
Also tonight, immigration detention and cost of living failures ruin the final week of Parliament for the Albanese government before Christmas. No relief presents for Christmas as the government hosed down cost of living assistant expectations. And later, Dr. Power's comments.
This is the evening news with Ivan Leung and Paige Reid.
Good evening. More migration slashes your cost of living. That's the argument from Perth community leaders challenge the mainstream narrative, asserting that increased migration is the key to lowering the cost of living for Western Australians. It comes as Prime Minister Albanese is preparing to slash Australia's migration and international students intake this coming week. Multicultural advocate Suresh Rajan stated his arguments during an exclusive interview on this matter. Suresh, thanks for being here. The common argument is that migration contributes to the cost of living increase because of housing shortages, putting pressure on public services and so on. But I understand you are arguing the exact opposite. What's your view and why do you think that's the case?
Certainly all of the economic studies indicate that what happens when migrants come to Australia, come to any country, is that they are going to be part of the productive process in the economy, therefore producing more goods that are available for people to purchase. Now, what we know is the classic definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. What you have then is now an increase in production, more goods available, and then companies are able to reduce the price of those goods because they can actually make the same amount of money because they've got greater demand for the same goods. So what you will see is more goods available, and therefore it's not the too much money chasing too few goods. The goods are available. In my view, what you will see with migration of any kind is that it will ultimately lead to a reduction in the cost of living.
Hang on, are you saying that migration actually reduces the cost of living?
Very much so. I think it can reduce the cost of living by increasing the production, and the GDP is increased quite considerably. Production is increased, more goods available. Companies are able to then reduce the price of those goods because they have a lower margin on more goods being sold and achieve the same level of profit as they were before. So therefore, you can actually see a reduction in costs as well. So and reduction in prices. So which is again that classic definition of inflation is the prices going up. What you can see is a reduction in costs because of the reduction in prices because of the increased number of goods that are available for purchase.
Just very quickly, the government is going to slash international student numbers. What do you think of the Prime Minister's move?
I'm not in favour of any reduction in overseas student numbers. One of the issues that we point to there is the fact that when international students come here and they pay fees for their for their studies that they're doing, and they're paying some considerable amount in fees, what those fees do is actually reduce the cost to mainstream students, Australian students, because the universities are able to subsidize more places available to the local students because of the fact that all of the money is being made from international students. So what you will see is a reduction in costs for those mainstream students, mainstream families, because they are now being more and more heavily subsidized by more international students rather than less. So the lesser you make the international student numbers, the more it's going to increase the cost to local students to achieve their degree courses and their studies. And so therefore it is just a classic definition of actually contributing to local students by cutting the number of students. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
It's a very tricky situation indeed, given that universities are only profitable because they're relying on international students. You can read the full story now on the WIMN Extra News Club. Suresh Rajan, thanks for your time and Merry Christmas to you.
And the best to you and all of your viewers.
Immigration detention, cost of living and falling popularity continue to cause havoc for the Albanese government as the final Parliament sitting week concludes before the festive season. There are strong suggestions that the federal Labor may try to capitalise the Liberals' weak position with the possibility of an early election in 2024. Here is Peter Kennedy.
Well, the end of the year can't come soon enough for Mr Albanese and his government. It hasn't been a happy few weeks. The main issue, of course, during 2023 has been the referendum on the voice. The result wasn't good for Mr Albanese. The fact that the Australian public rejected the proposal, not only rejected it, but rejected it strongly. So that was a setback for Mr Albanese because he'd put a lot of political capital into the issue of the voice. But it didn't get much better. And as the year closes, the government has had a problem with the refugees, the High Court decision, and the fact that some of the refugees who were released, or the detainees who were released, have been charged with offences. So the issue of community safety uppermost, and the government, I think, in the eyes of many people, has been found wanting. So as far as Mr Albanese is concerned, yes, the end of the year he'll be hoping for a break. And I think some of his ministers will be hoping for a break too. Some of the ministers, say for instance the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, got involved in a snap with a reporter in Canberra. The publicity for that wasn't good. Claire O'Neill also had some problems, and the Immigration Minister as well. So look, the government doesn't end the year in good shape. It provides them with an opportunity though to regroup and come out in 2024 with a fresh approach. The issues in 2024 will continue to be economic. There's the issue of the Reserve Bank. Will it be increasing interest rates? A suggestion that perhaps the cycle may have come to an end, or just about come to an end. That'll be a relief not only for the government, it'll also be a relief for home buyers, many of whom have found the escalation in interest rates very difficult to cope with. So, look, on the economic front, a number of challenges for the government. On the refugee front, or the detainees front, challenges there. Health issues, that's an issue there. The NDIS, has the government put the brakes on the escalating cost of the NDIS, growing at the rate of 14% a year. The government plans to bring it back to a more manageable 8%. At that stage, it's still a lot of money, but it's far more manageable than 14%. So, as 2023 ends, Mr Albanese, plenty on his plate. As I say, he'll be relieved to go to Christmas and hope that things can regroup in 2024. The suggestion, though, if the government can regroup and come back fighting, as it were, just possibly could be an early election towards the end of 2024. It'll depend on how the government's fortunes are placed, but also how Peter Dutton and the Liberals are managing. If Labor thinks that the Liberals are struggling, the idea of an early election might be very, very tempting. So as we go into the Christmas break, Politics in Australia, very interesting indeed, and as I say, the government has had some problems during 2023. They'll be hoping to come in with 2024 with a fresh approach. Happy Christmas. Peter Kennedy, WA-MN News.
Struggling families hoping for relief from the government are left disappointed as Treasurer Chalmers brushed off suggestions that there will be any financial support this festive season. When asked whether he's concerned about the reduction in household savings, Dr. Chalmers says the government knows Australians are doing especially tough and their policies are reducing the cost of living sting for families.
Recent data released by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare has sent shockwaves through Western Australia, indicating its emergency departments are grappling with the lowest patient on-time service rates in the nation. The Australian Nursing Federation WA Secretary Janet Ray emphasises that WA is not only affected by the global shortage of nurses and midwives, but it's experiencing these shortages more severely than other states.
My concern is it's not even the height of the flu season, and yet we have overflowing tertiary hospitals redirecting patients not only to secondary hospitals, but hospitals that are rural or remote, and that's just not good enough.
A 15-year-old girl has been charged following an alleged stabbing attack at a school in Perth's north. The incident occurred at Colin Senior High School just after 10 a.m, prompting the immediate lockdown and response of emergency services. 2 students aged 15 and 16 were allegedly involved in the incident, with both parties inflicting wounds on one another. Police believe the wounds were caused by a weapon due to their injuries. However, neither had injuries that were considered life-threatening. Both teenagers were taken to the hospital with police to be treated for their injuries, while the high school promptly initiated a lockdown to ensure the safety of other students on the campus. Police quickly confirmed there were no other people involved and no larger threat to the community. A 15-year-old female student has been charged with aggravated unlawful wounding.
Vietnam Airlines non-stop flight from Ho Chi Minh City to Perth touched down in Perth for the first time, marking the start of a new route between Perth and Vietnam. The new route will enable nearly 43,000 people to travel from the Vietnam capital city each year. With flights 3 times a week, the Cook government is hoping to boost business opportunities and partnerships between Perth and Vietnam. The Deputy Premier says these new direct flights are an important role in WA's tourism strategy, as WA's government knows people are more likely to travel to places that are easier to access.
We're very, very pleased. This is yet another example of WA reconnecting to the rest of the world, but importantly into a market that we're very excited about, both as a place for Western Australians to visit, but even better, the ability for Vietnamese people to come to WA.
And now here's Dr. Karina Powers with a weekly medical and news commentary.
Hi everyone, we're still having rolling cases here in WA. So the wave is ongoing. It's not a high peak and then a sudden roll off that peak. It's a grumbling number of cases that continue to occur on a daily basis. We do have to be mindful of our residents in residential aged care facilities and make sure that we don't go there if we're unwell, ideally. And it's a good idea to wear a mask or a respirator N95 if you are visiting relatives in residential aged care facilities and they're able to hear you still. So, yes, because sometimes we don't know that we've got an infection and we need to protect others. So masks protect ourselves and also other people from spreading an infection we may not realise that we're starting to brew or incubate. Now, the news from Canada is that if you're having COVID 1, 2, 3 times, every time you catch COVID, your risk of prolonged symptoms following that disease increases. And by about the 3rd time, that risk is sitting at about 2.6 times your for prolonged symptoms. So it's important to get vaccinated, try and avoid catching COVID. So make sure you organise things in fresh air or areas where there is good ventilation. So I'm hoping that you are all starting to enjoy the festive season in a safe way. Everyone else that you can with consideration. Take care.
So, Ivan, the countdown is on for Christmas. Are you ready?
Hey, less than 2 weeks to go. I mean, I'm certainly ready. What about you?
Yeah, really looking forward to it. I'm looking to spending time with my family.
Well, for me, it's 3 weeks worth of no news, no nothing, just switch off, right? Lucky me. You can't get luckier than me.
And that's our weekly news and current affairs. We have all the latest news on our website at wamnnews.com.au.
Remember to subscribe to the WAMN Extra News Club so we can continue our work in the community. Full details on wamnnews.com.au/news/extra. From Paige and myself, wish you good health, good night. See you next Sunday.
Thanks for being with us.
Hello and welcome to Between Parks Place and Capitol Hill, the Six News program all about law and government in Australia. I'm your host Stuart Jeffrey, GovCheck editor, and joining me is parliamentary reporter Aidan Edgecombe. The focus here is, of course, on the recent migration cases, Ben Breaker and Minister for Home Affairs, Jones and Commonwealth, and now NZYQ is the latest one to come out. We've just received the judgment a few days ago at the time of recording. We had recorded this beforehand, and I actually said to Aidan, nah, look, we're not going to get a judgment until next year. And then literally the next day, we get the High Court saying, we'll release it tomorrow. So this is our second time recording this. Of course, we do now have the reasons. So we will be spending a lot of time looking at those reasons, but it's not the first case. NZYQ, while important, especially because of the child sexual offences involved, there isn't that big in and of itself. It's taken in the broader context of Ben Breaker and of Jones. So I might get you to start off, Aidan, just what is the importance of Ben Breaker here? Because it's the first of the three cases that we have to deal with.
So Ben Breaker is essentially clarifying the fact that the executive government, so a minister, can't strip the citizenship of someone as a punitive measure. In other words, as a punishment. So the case Ben Breaker regarded a man who was convicted of terrorism offences, which made it a hot political issue. But from a legal perspective, he was charged with crimes. He served his time and is still serving time in jail for those crimes and had his citizenship stripped because of this. And Ben Breaker, the case, found that this was unlawful, given that the executive government can't be punishing people for crimes they commit. The courts, the judicial branch of government is able to, but not the executive. Of course, this is relating to the separation of powers, and we'll get into that much later. But essentially, the executive government was unable to strip his citizenship, and it was put just to the role of the court to do so. The exception to this was Jones versus Commonwealth, which you mentioned briefly, Stuart, which clarifies, again, an exception to Ben Breaker, that citizenship can be stripped if the crimes in question were committed before the person became a citizen. So if you commit crimes of terrorism or whatever it may be, and then are granted citizenship after you committed those crimes, the executive branch of government can strip you of your citizenship.
Of course, and the issue here, you're correct, is with separation of power. With Ben Breaker, so we don't have true separation of power in Australia, like in the US sense, but we also don't have what we call parliamentary sovereignty, which is what they have in the UK with the Westminster system. Our courts are strictly independent because the Constitution has 3 chapters. Though it has more than 3, but the first 3 talk about the legislative and then looking at the executive and the courts. And so the way that it's been interpreted is that there are therefore 3 different branches of government, the courts being a distinct branch of government, different from the executive and legislative, which kind of overlap because all the ministers and the Prime Minister are drawn from Parliament. So the way this works is that the court has said in the case of Ben Breaker that, the punitive powers are exclusively the job of the courts. So it's basically double jeopardy in one aspect. Of course, the court didn't describe it that way, but it's similar to double jeopardy in that the court's meant to punish someone. You kind of the executive going, we're going to put you in detention as well, just for the exact same crime. And of course, the government's going to try and change that right now, which we'll get to shortly. However, in Jones, of course, the difference is that Section 51 of the Constitution gives Parliament certain powers on what it can create laws on. And one of those powers is the aliens power, not UFO aliens, foreigners, non-citizens. So in that sense, the court's gone, separation of powers exists, but because the Constitution gives the government exclusive authority over this, or because it gives Parliament exclusive authority, we can't do anything because the Constitution says otherwise.
The separation of powers at the federal level between the executive, legislative, and judicial. This doesn't quite exist the same way at a state level. Obviously, being a separate jurisdiction, there are different sort of rights granted to state governments, and parliamentary sovereignty, which you mentioned briefly earlier, is emphasized a lot more at a state level. I've talked about this in an article I wrote about the Victorian Greens proposing a constitutional change. And of course, federally, to change the Australian Constitution, the only way to do so is a referendum. But state constitutions are given authority under Acts of Parliament, and in most cases can be amended through Acts of Parliament. It doesn't need to go to a referendum of the people. And this gives the government a lot more will to be able to legislate on these issues.
And of course, this gives rise to a great debate between separation of powers and the Westminster system, and it is one we have seen in the High Court in recent years. Most recently, Garlett from last year, Garlett in Western Australia, which was generally seen by the legal community as a serious erosion of the cable doctrine, which said, state Supreme Courts, they have federal power, therefore they should be independent. State parliaments can't tell them what to do. They're going to be a bit more independent. In Garlett, the High Court said, but no. It was basically the High Court. The High Court said, state governments can determine, when and how this should be applied. They gave them a lot more scope in how to use these powers. In that case, it was something as simple as an aggravated robbery, which in that case was $20, I believe, and a necklace, and that was sufficient to then put in place a protection order to keep Garlett in prison for a longer period of time. However, in that case, we saw strong dissents from now Chief Justice Gageler and also from Justice Gordon, and a kind of dissent from Justice Edelman, who had different reasons to the majority, which at the time included Chief Justice Kiefel, who was since retired, and Justice Keane and Justice Stewart, who is still on the bench. So we do have this ongoing struggle, which we have seen in Ben Breaker and in Jones, where we have dissent from Stewart, who is probably the strongest defender of parliamentary sovereignty on the High Court right now. Going into Ben Breaker, I had said we're going to see a dissent from Stewart again. However, we saw a unanimous judgment from the High Court, and that included Stewart agreeing with the rest of the court on this issue, which said that, that we draw a line in the sand here. You cannot detain asylum seekers indefinitely if there is no reasonable chance that they can be deported overseas. And of course, the important thing here is reasonable chance. The High Court had said previously, absolute chance.
Yeah, the reasonable chance, that sort of distinction is very important here, because it involves the issue of proportionality, whether something is a proportionate response to a certain issue. You can't just do something that you have an issue that has certain implications. You can't have a major overbearing response to that issue purely because of, say, one area. It has to be proportionate to the actual issue at hand. And as you say in NZYQ, the response, the judgment wasn't unanimous, but Justice Edelman did have his separate reasons for the judgment, and this heavily involves proportionality, whether something is reasonable, and again, it mentions in the specific case of NZYQ, the possibility of the plaintiff, of the offender of the sexual assault cases being relocated to the US. Now, in Al-Kateb, a previous case, it was found that indefinite detention is lawful, and even if the prospect of deportation is incredibly thin, as long as it does exist in a way, the person can be detained. Now, this was then overturned by NZYQ with the strong emphasis on proportionality, whether there's a reasonable possibility of deportation, and it was heard in the court that it was possible that the plaintiff could be deported to America, or could be relocated, to America, but this wasn't reasonable in the foreseeable future. And this was sort of the difference between Edelman's reasons to the rest of the majority, with the strong emphasis placed on, is the response proportionate?
Exactly, proportionality is definitely, so we've seen long-time readers of the Commonwealth Knowledge series will know that I've probably like half a dozen articles now on what we call the implied freedom of political communication, which is the closest thing we have to free speech, although it's no longer referred to as free speech. It's more of a equal opportunity to engage in politics in Australia as part of the fundamental nature of democracy, where people have to have a say, which is why we vote. And of course, to be able to vote, you have to be able to have the conversation about political issues. And of course, there's a proportionality test devised there, which says, okay, at what point can we limit speech? For example, with protesting, we saw a lot of protests during COVID, whether it be anti-lockdown protests or Black Lives Matter protests. The court saying that's not a reasonable use of the implied freedom because of the health implications there. However, we have also seen at Brown and Tasmania, for example, they have said, okay, the response to protests here is disproportionate. We need to strike down these laws. So proportionality, again, it's something that Justice Edelman is well known for advocating. In Garlett, for example, I mentioned that he kind of agreed, kind of didn't agree. He gave his own reasons, which was based on proportionality. In that case, he said that it was, in giving the Parliament that power, it was okay, but it was perilously close to not being okay. If it had have gone a little bit further and given the Parliament a little bit more sovereignty, he would have drawn a line in the sand there. And of course, this proportionality is kind of similar, but also different to the reasonable test, which we have now for the chance of being deported. Al-Kateb, of course, as you mentioned, Al-Kateb and Gordon, it's from 2004. We had a 3-4 split on the High Court, 4-3 split for upholding legislation under John Howard, which said that there must be an absolute chance that they cannot be deported in order for the detention to be unlawful. Among the dissenters in that case was of course Justice Michael Kirby, who was known for his dissents. It's him and Justice Hayden who are probably the two biggest dissenters in the High Court's history. And so now we've seen the court respond to that and say, well, unanimously, it's now only a reasonable chance, because there's always a remote possibility that they could be deported. However, the High Court has said, yes, it's a reasonable chance. But if the situation changes and the laws change and it now becomes reasonable that they can be deported, you can put them back in detention. So it's only while there is no reasonable chance, but if a chance arises, they can then be put back in detention. So that's a key difference there, is they didn't say that there was, it was absolutely, didn't say there was, they were free forever. They said if there becomes a chance where they could be deported, and it is a reasonable chance, then okay, you put them back in detention until that opportunity passes or until they do actually get deported. If that then becomes no longer likely, they get released again. However, the important thing here to mention is that these people who have committed crimes, which is why they've had their visa stripped, the court said, yep, but they're still going to face the exact same punishments as everyone else. Just because they can't be held in detention doesn't mean they are exempt from criminal law in Australia.
That's exactly right. And just want to touch on that last thing you mentioned of the Australian law applies to them just as much as any other citizen of Australia, which as you say, means that they can be redetained if there is a reasonable chance of deportation. But more importantly, that the implications of cases like Garlett, which allow people to be continuously detained continuously imprisoned, because of a serious risk of reoffending and an impact to community safety. This can still apply to the people affected by NZYQ, and Edelman himself, Justice Edelman, mentioned this, saying that if there is a reasonable risk of reoffending and it does pose a threat to community safety, someone can very easily continue to be imprisoned in the same way that any other citizen of Australia can be. Touching back to Benbrica quickly, this was also important in that obviously his citizenship can't be removed, but the Attorney General is likely to apply for his imprisonment to continue to exist even after his sentence ends. So this whole idea of, yes, they can't be indefinitely detained if there isn't a reasonable, or it's indefinite, if there isn't a reasonable chance for deportation, they can't be indefinitely detained. But they do still face the same requirements under the law as any other Australian citizen. And this is, I suppose, where the political pressure starts to come in terms of, well, what criteria is going to be involved in terms of their release? Because I believe one of the people who has been released from indefinite detention has now been charged with other offences. So in terms of the community safety aspect, there's a lot of political pressure on the government to keep, the tagline is to keep the community safe.
NZYQ, or a situation where, yes, it was unanimous, but it actually wasn't unanimous. All 7 judges came to vote together. However, there were actually 3 camps. And this is a very cumbersome ruling, because normally what you'd have is the core group here is Justice Stewart, Justice Beach Jones, Justice Gordon, and Chief Justice Gager, and they form the core judgment. Normally, what you'd see is them doing a what we call majority judgment, where the 4 of them are a majority of the court. They'd write a judgment, and then the other judges would say they agree, but in this case, Justices Gleeson and Jaggett actually hadn't decided when they gave the judgment, which is why Chief Justice Gager said at least a majority of the court, because Justices Gleeson and Jaggett hadn't actually made up their minds at the time. They've since decided, yeah, it's unlawful. But what you would normally see is you'd see those 2 justices say, well, we don't know if they both disagreed for the same reasons or if it was differently, but we'd see them usually say, I concur with the rulings of the majority, and that's it. But they're doing that they aren't part of the majority in and of themselves; they're just agreeing with it. And then you see Justice Edelman, who gave his own judgment on proportionality, but he gave it as part of the majority's judgment. You'd see him saying, I agree with the majority on most of what they said, except for on these points. Very annoyingly, we've now got one big judgment, so it's hard to work out what the exact reasoning is, because we don't know what the concerns of Justices Gleeson and Jaggett were, and we don't know, and we don't have a full explanation from Edelman on why he wrote differently. So it is going to be a bit difficult. It's easier than Uncle Ted, where you had each judge giving their own judgment, but we do have a cumbersome judgment now. It's going to be hard to work out exactly how each judge fell, especially again because Beach Jones is an unknown. He's been in the High Court for less than a month, at the time of recording at least, about a month. So we don't know which way he will fall. Jaggett, again, pretty unclear, because Garlett was before her time. She, of course, replaced Justice Keane shortly after Garlett was handed down. So we don't know all the details about how the court will fall on that. But it is likely that it will be challenged. Given how controversial it is, it will be passed by Liberals and Labor, because it is based on previous Liberal laws. And the Liberals have actually said they're not going to decide until the 7th. We're recording this on the 6th. They won't decide until the 7th on how they want to fall on the case. But they've given it support in the Senate already. So it's passed the Senate. It's now back to the House of Reps, where Labor has a majority, and Labor MPs can't dissent against the rest of the party. So it will end up passing, because Liberals backed it in the Senate. So it will become law. We could see a challenge in the new year. However, it does form part of the broader context we have of parliamentary sovereignty versus separation of powers.
Yeah, the the whole debate regarding parliamentary sovereignty and separation of powers, it's not a new topic, whilst it's certainly heating up in the light of NZYQ and the light of Benbrika especially. It's been around for quite a while. The example that I'll bring to light is the external affairs power in the Australian Constitution. Now, what it does is, I believe part of Section 51 gives the government, the Commonwealth government, the right to legislate on external affairs, which is in other words foreign affairs, things that are going to impact our relationship with other nations. Now, this is the most common interpretation of this, or at least when it has been used, is in regarding to United Nations agreements or conventions. Now, this was seen, of course, in the Tasmanian Dams case, where Australia signing and ratifying the UN Convention into law, it provides some sort of expectation that we will follow through with that. And what it did find is that if we didn't do so, it could have potential to impact our external affairs with other countries. But this is a major proponent of parliamentary sovereignty because, of course, when the Constitution was written, the United Nations didn't exist. It hadn't formed until after World War II. So what it does, and by the court affirming, laws in relation to UN conventions, what it does is it allows the parliament more freedom to decide what matters are going to impact our external affairs. And though the United Nations is perhaps the biggest way we've seen this done, this isn't specifically outlined in the Constitution. It's only referring to a judgment or a decision from the parliament that, hey, this is going to impact our standing with other countries. We've got an international mandate or an international agreement to do something, so we're going to make sure we do this. And that is parliamentary sovereignty. It's giving the parliament the right to do that.
There's actually a fight between Chu Keng Lim and Al Kateb, which is the 2004 case. And confusingly, the High Court has said, okay, well, Al Kateb's been around for, at this point, 19 years. And no one's ever tried to challenge it. No one's tried to ever overturn it properly. There's been some discussion of overturning it, but it's never actually been overturned. And that's because it is an accepted part of the law. But at the same time, the High Court's gone, it's an outlier. The actual way they use this is an outlier, that somehow it's an outlier. And I personally I don't get how it can be both an outlier, but also a part of law that's so concrete that it hasn't been challenged for 2 decades. But we are seeing it. Dr. Joe McIntyre actually referred to this, and I'm going to borrow his term there, age of limb. Going through the judgment, the High Court referred to Chapter 3. Of course, Chu Keng Lim draws its basis from Chapter 3, separation of powers. Again, punitive measures are the job of the courts, not the executive. So the High Court here has referred to Chapter 3, which is the basis for the separation of powers, 17 times, or 16 or 17 times. They referred to Chu Keng Lim 36 times, and that's only including footnotes. It'd be about 40 if you include footnote references there. So more than double the references to Lim rather than to Chapter 3. And this isn't the best idea, because the risk here is if they somehow strike down Chu Keng Lim, which is very unlikely, especially with Gageler as Chief Justice, potentially after he retires, which is not going to be for a few years yet, is that basing everything on Chu Keng Lim is kind of putting all your eggs in one basket in a legal sense. If Chu Keng Lim gets overturned, then everything else is pretty much overturned as well. This is a concern that I've raised with a few other people about this judgment, is that it does probably rely a bit too much on Chu Keng Lim rather than Chapter 3. There is some reference to Chapter 3. For example, Justice Edelman said Chapter 3 of the Constitution extends beyond those classical criminal notions of punishment based upon just desert to another analogous instances of protective punishment. That's it's very, 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 very complex, but the next sentence shines a lot more light on it, and the purpose of a law which is concerned with executive punishment in this sense would be illegitimate with regards to what we have right now. So it very much is still about executive punishment, and when it is illegitimate, and that's probably one of the better descriptions of Chapter 3 we have here, in that that's Chapter 3 and the Lim have the exact same focus. And so His Honour actually goes to deal with that, and although again to draw from the exact same judgment, the approach of Edelman J is slightly different, although perhaps only because it disaggregates the concept of punishment as used in Lim. And that's exactly the point here, is that Justice Edelman was trying to make the point that, Chapter 3 is more important than Lim. It is the age of Lim, in that we are relying more on case law for separation of powers than the Constitution itself. And you do then run the risk of, you've got cases like Al Quteb, which back up parliamentary sovereignty, cases like Duke and Lim, and now NZYQ and Benbrika, which back separation of powers. And it ends up becoming a battle of common law against common law rather than constitutional law. It does kind of distract from the overlying principles in the Constitution by relying on case law. However, fingers crossed, it does change. We could see a challenge to the new legislation that we are seeing from Parliament, but that's not going to be decided until next year. Hopefully, we see the court move towards Chapter 3 more than just relying on Chu Kang Lim, because again, all your eggs in one basket. It's not a unanimous judgment. I know that there are others who disagree with me, who do think that Chu Kang Lim is an important case. It is kind of basically a synonym of Chapter 3. So the question is whether it is the same as, or whether it draws from Chapter 3. But at least in my opinion, and I try not to get political about this, but at least in my opinion, we do see a bit too much of a reliance on Lim in this case. A bit more discussion of Chapter 3 would be useful here. Lim, again, is a very important case. The two most important separation of power cases right now, or actually three, you've got Boilermaker's case, which is the one that set the ground for it early in the 50s for separation of power. But you've got Cable, which we've already mentioned, and Chu Kang Lim as the two biggest separation of power cases that we see right now that are in use. Cable has kind of been eroded into the point of Garlett. And that's just not me talking. When Garlett came out last year, there was a lot of anger in the legal community about the decision in Garlett. Hopefully that gets overturned. I've spoken to many, many people, and the general consensus is that Garlett is unpopular, especially given the fact that you then got to factor in the fact that Garlett was an Aboriginal man. So the justice system is traditionally is seen by many as being geared against Aboriginal people, giving them less consideration to their situation. So you do have to also factor in that as well in overturning Garlett. But we are looking towards seeing the court move towards separation of powers more than we are to parliamentary sovereignty. Although, as I mentioned earlier, when I did this the last time with Aidan, I said, yeah, we're going to see Justice Stewart dissent because parliamentary sovereignty. In reality, we saw Edelman dissent, and Stewart joined part of the court majority alongside Gagler and Gordon. So take what I'm saying with a grain of salt here, that I could be wrong, given the fact that I said Stewart would dissent, and we're now seeing unanimous judgment, with the exception of Edelman having his own little, by the way, aside.
Yeah, I think what I do think is it's hard to predict these sort of things. In some ways, you could argue that they do contradict itself, because you talk about Stewart and the fact that he agreed with the majority despite being a major supporter of parliamentary sovereignty. And you did talk about the whole Lim versus Chapter 3 debate and which one should we be relying upon more. I don't want to speculate too much, but perhaps in Stewart's sort of, you don't know his exact reasoning or his thought process behind it, but if we do see, which we did see in the case, a lot of reference to Lim opposed to Chapter 3, it's a bit more of a case law focus, though Lim does involve separation of powers rather than the whole proponent of separation of powers being Chapter 3. It's more of the case, the precedent set in the case, which you could definitely see why Stewart would support that more than I suppose the founding thought process behind the separation of powers in Chapter 3. So it's hard to predict, as you mentioned, what not only future governments are going to do, but what the courts will judge in terms of the laws being passed, whether they'll be proportionate. There's obviously the Edelman, the proportionality test will play a big part in it, but at what point does it take in the parliamentary sovereignty versus separation of powers debate? And what are we relying upon to base these arguments that we make? Are we relying on case law, or are we relying on a constitutional mandate? And if we're relying on case law, well, it's hard to say you know, we say cables being eroded and we reference Garland, and it's very true. It's that in itself is by definition enhancing parliamentary sovereignty. But then we see Ben Breaker and NZYQ sort of take away from that, which is why I do say that it, in some ways it contradicts itself, or not contradicts itself, but the different cases and the different judgments in different cases, whilst legally you could say, you know, they've got their own reasons and they fit certain bounds and certain means, where they fit into the wider parliamentary sovereignty versus separation of powers debates, they do sort of have opposite interpretations in terms of what you can sit back and go, well, this means that the court is going to follow a line of separation of powers or parliamentary sovereignty in the future. If future laws come up, they will, you know, be more likely to judge in this way. And it's really hard to do that when we sort of have opposing and contradicting views, with Stewart especially, right? Being a massive supporter of parliamentary sovereignty in Garland and then agreeing with the majority in NZYQ. You know, it makes it difficult. You can make predictions and people like you and scholars smarter than me will make predictions, but in terms of actually knowing where different individual justices and where the court as a whole will rule on these things, it's definitely not easy to do. And it's why we may not know until the laws do get challenged, if they get challenged. And in that case, we'll have to see what happens.
I've been Stuart Jeffrey. This is Aidan Edgecombe, and thank you for watching.
From the moment you get up, 6 News has you covered. We'll keep you informed with what's happened overnight, both here at home and overseas, and let you know what to expect right throughout the day.
Extraordinary scenes overnight.
Going to be a big day.
The news starts here every morning on 6 News.
Merry Christmas from all of us here at 6 News.
Merry Christmas, Australia.
Merry Christmas from all of us at 6 News.
Merry Christmas from all of us here at 6 News.
From all of us here at 6 News, have a very safe and Merry Christmas. Top of the hour every hour, good evening. An initial IDF probe into the killings of 3 Israeli hostages by Israeli forces suggests all were shirtless, with one holding a makeshift white flag. More than 130 hostages are believed to still be in Gaza, with an additional 100 released since October 7. On seeing these 3 men, one Israeli soldier reportedly shouted "terrorists" to the other forces, initiating fire. 2 hostages were hit immediately and fell to the ground, but a third managed to escape at a nearby building while screaming for help in Hebrew. However, he was also shot and killed. The IDF says it had mistakenly identified 3 Israeli hostages as a threat and as a result fired towards them. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described it as a difficult and unbearable tragedy. Israeli bulldozers have crushed Palestinians taking shelter in tents outside Gaza's Kamal Adwan hospital, according to reports from multiple media outlets, several witnesses and medics. Multiple graphic videos posted to social media by local journalists, which have been verified by 6 News as being taken at the hospital within the past 24 hours, appear to show bodies under destroyed tent material. Al Jazeera Arabic's Anas al-Sharif said, per Al Jazeera, quote, "Dozens of displaced, sick and wounded people were buried alive. Bulldozers trampled the tents of the displaced people in the hospital yard and brutally crushed them." Gaza's health minister has called for an investigation into information that people had been buried alive in the hospital yard. UN humanitarian agency OCHA earlier reported that Kamal Adwan Hospital was surrounded by Israeli troops and tanks, with 65 patients, including 12 children in ICU and 6 newborns in incubators inside. Several Queensland ministers are out of the cabinet as Stephen Miles settles in as the new Premier. He's set to face an election in less than a year and has told 6 News he is confident that the best choice for Queenslanders continues to be Labor. National Affairs editor Austin Pollock has more from outside State Parliament in Brisbane.
Ready to get to work after being sworn in.
But now it's really about delivering for Queenslanders. It's not about us. It's never been about us. It's about what's best for Queensland.
The new Premier not quite familiar with his new role.
Stephen Miles, Queensland Premier. It is the first time I've said that. And I and our entire... Today, the Deputy Premier and I...
Knuckling down just 10 months out from the state election, announcing a new slogan for their government.
This is about fresh faces and a fresh focus.
And fresh policies, a bold emissions reduction target, decreasing emissions by 75% before 2035, and a complete review of all development projects for the 2032 Olympic Games, with the controversial Gabba redevelopment now up in the air.
We need to do that in conjunction with all of the partners. We'll need to talk to all of them before we settle those details.
Plus providing cost of living relief, fixing community safety issues, health and housing supply.
We want to spend the next 10 months delivering on the things that Queenslanders care about.
A new look ministry is set to be unveiled tomorrow, hoping the fresh faces give a fresh start to the government. But the opposition is hoping voters won't buy in.
The same people who've sat around the table that have delivered the youth crime crisis, the housing crisis and the health crisis. Queenslanders are looking and they're seeing more of the same.
6 News was the first and only media outlet to speak to Stephen Miles one-on-one just minutes after being elected by his party as the 40th Premier of Queensland.
So how was it in there with the caucus meeting?
Look, it was a really good meeting and I'm really honoured to have the support of my colleagues. But now it's really about delivering for Queenslanders. I'll be off to the Governor's house she'll swear me in, and then we'll get straight to work. I'm confident that the best thing for Queensland is a Labor government. I know that an LNP government would be very, very dangerous for Queensland.
The cabinet is set for a shake-up with 5 new ministers in Nikki Boyd, Barton Mellish, Lance McCallum, Michael Healy and Therese Mullen, their portfolios yet to be confirmed. However, Therese is expected to be the Transport Minister, with Glenn Butcher, Police Minister, and Michael Healy as Tourism Minister. Ministers losing portfolios: Mark Bailey, the retiring Sterling Hinchcliffe, Craig Crawford, and Anastasia Palaszczuk.
What do you have to say to her about her leadership?
She's a dear friend. She's done a great service to Queensland, and she will always be remembered as a trailblazer for women and an inspiration for young girls.
Stephen Miles, unlike Palaszczuk, has confirmed he will not be the Minister for the Olympics, adding one more MP into the mix. The role of Police Minister Mark Ryan is also up in the air, with rumours he may become Attorney General, ousting Yvette Duff.
It's an exceptional honour to be a minister in any government, but when you get to work alongside the heroes of your community, not sure yet about what the ministerial portfolio allocation will be, but I love the agencies that I've got responsibility for at the moment, and I hope they appreciate that they mean a big part of me and my service to Queensland.
The New Look Ministry will be sworn in on Monday. Austin Pollock, 6 News.
Heavy rain continues in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Jasper in far north Queensland. The Bureau of Meteorology says more than 500 millimetres of rain has fallen since 9 a.m. Saturday. Several thunderstorms were warned for in central and southeast parts of the state, while intense rainfall warnings in place for the far north. Hundreds of households remain without power, with 40,000 initially left in the dark following Jasper. The Treasurer has forecast a possibility of more cost of living relief in the next federal budget. Jim Chalmers says the government will factor in several elements to see whether further assistance is provided, as new polling shows frustration growing amongst the public. Political editor Roman McKinnon has more.
Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers has announced a potential to ease the pain of cost of living in next year's budget. The Guardian is reporting that the Treasurer is working on measures to help families with cost of living if it doesn't fuel inflationary pressures. The mid-year budget update was handed down during the week, with Chalmers also looking at a new policy for accelerating the transition to net zero emissions. Chalmers said, quote, "People are still under pressure. It won't just get to January 1 and all of a sudden all that pressure people feel will just disappear, unfortunately. If I could click my fingers and make it disappear, I would." He also went on to say that the government will, quote, "factor in the pressures that people are facing, the budget position and the economic circumstances to see whether we will provide some further assistance and some further relief."
Responsible economic management, it's what puts downward pressure on inflation and eases the cost of living. And because of our efforts, we are getting the budget in much better nick and making more room for our priorities, and that's what these numbers that we are releasing today show. Our strategy over the past 18 months has delivered an historic turnaround in the budget position, but we know that there is still much more work to do. Our government's economic plan is at its core about 3 things: easing cost of living pressures, repairing the budget, and investing in the foundations of growth in our economy.
Recent opinion polling is showing support for Albanese and the Labor government is decreasing, with voters becoming frustrated about not taking enough action to ease cost of living. The latest news poll conducted at the end of last month shows Albanese's approval rating sitting at 40, while his disapproval is at 53 points. Labor took a 4-point hit in primary voting, sitting at just 31, while the opposition is at 38. Anthony Albanese remains the preferred Prime Minister, outpolling Peter Dutton 46 to 35. On Thursday, it was announced that unemployment rose to 3.9%, and in November, while the cash rate remains at 4.35%, while the RBA isn't expected to meet until February.
Founding AC/DC drummer Colin Burgess has died. Burgess was an original member of the Aussie rock band when it began in 1973, but was fired the following year after being accused of being drunk on stage. He was later inducted into the ARIA Hall of Fame for his work with rock group The Masters Apprentices. No cause of death was given. He was 77. That is 6 News for now. You can of course stay up to date by heading to our website and following us on social media at SIXNewsAU. News is on the hour every hour here on 6 News. For now though, I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Thanks for your company. Good night.